Today we have a very interesting conversation that we're excited about. We have representatives from Rockstar Games, and we also have representatives from Texas A&M University here. And I will let you guys do a little brief introduction, please, on who you are and how it is that you use Houdini in your either studio or institution. And let's go ahead and start with André Thomas from Texas A&M.
Well, thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. So my name is André Thomas. I'm a professor at Texas A&M in the visualization department. I've been here for about coming up to 8 years now. Before then, I spent 22 years in the movie and games industry. That's where I started learning Houdini and used Houdini. And when I came to A&M, first as an industry advisor, I would always tell the students and faculty, you really got to learn Houdini. That's the future of production. And since I became a faculty here, I keep doing the same thing, telling all my students and fellow faculty, you've got to use Houdini. That's no longer the future, it's the present. If you aren't, then you're kind of putting yourself out of a job today. Because so much content is required, and the old production methodologies of pulling vertices and pushing pixels are just not up to task to create the amount of content that's needed.
Yeah, totally agree. That's awesome. That's awesome. And Louise or Nick, whoever one of you would like to go first, our representatives from Rockstar Games.
You can go, Nick.
All right, fine. I'm Nick Greco. I'm the director of visual effects at Rockstar Games. We've been using Houdini now on the visual effects team probably for the last 7 years or so. We use it for everything as far as texture creation, down to like RBD pipelines. I think we're trying to implement it a lot more within the studio and other departments as well. And I mean, we definitely see the benefit in the node-based workflow. And yeah, off to you, Luis.
Yeah, I'm Luis Cruel. I'm a principal technical artist at Rockstar. I have a little team of, I think, 4 or 5 people that are kind of scattered all over doing different stuff in Houdini. So we do everything from like hair, terrain, world building, mesh processing, and the kind of everything that is not effects related. Before Rockstar, I was at Side Effects for 4 years. You might recognize the background. It's very similar to the one that used to be in the videos. And yeah, and before that, I was in production. I worked with Andre, I think 15 years ago at Tiburon when I started. So so that's my background and that's what I'm up to.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for being here today with us. Just to give a little bit of framework for what we're doing during this particular session and overall for the Hive this year, we're trying to make sure that we're putting schools together with studios' needs. So we're wanting to have just a general conversation around how schools develop certain skills, how studios use those skills, maybe some gaps if we find gaps, and how we're working to bridge those things. And we're going to do it through just a series of general questions. So I'll kick it off just right off the bat, Andre, with the first question for you, which is, what is something about the program there at A&M that studios might be surprised to know or be surprised to learn about how you're teaching or developing skills for Houdini artists?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually part of what attracted me when I left industry to come to A&M, the uniqueness of the program here, where we are combining the technical with the artistic side. So we're not a pure technical or computer science department, and we're also not an art department. But we actually have computer scientists, artists, technologists all working together and shaping our students. So our students have to take traditional art classes as well as hardcore computer programming classes and everything in between. And then we have also practical, not just we're a research institution, not just theoretical classes, but we're also studio classes where they actually get to practice and turn that theory into practical projects.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. That's a great way to teach too, is to combine both the art and the technical. I know, Louise, that's something that you've always talked about too, is combining the technical side of things with the artistic side of things, and that they both need to be able to support each other. And I'm just wondering, is that something that maybe you found in junior artists amongst your whole body of work that has been either something that's lacking or something that you found to be good? And really the question is, what are the bigger like pain points that you find when you're working with artists that are right out of school? And I'll give both of you an opportunity, Nick and Louise, to answer, please.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's kind of like the depth of knowledge, if that makes sense. So like, there's a lot of people that like use the shelf tools or use kind of like some basic tools and kind of apply Houdini, which is good and it's valuable, and there's a job for that. But then on the tech art side, you need to know how to build those tools and kind of how to modify them to fit a need. So like, there's people that say, oh, I know how to use Houdini for effects, and it's like, okay, you go show me. And it's just like the default explosions, and they haven't really kind of pushed it that far from it, or they just use a tool, which is awesome, and it's like puts you ahead than probably 90% of the industry. But I think one of the pain points is kind of getting over that hump of, okay, can you solve a problem in Houdini, and like, can you modify the setup, and can you kind of go a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I think like from an like art director point of view, like you want to try to art direct these things, and if the artists don't know how to change like the fundamentals or the details of this stuff, get into the shader and make these things look completely different. Like if they don't understand that, then you have a hard time basically iterating on things. The other issue that we have too is that a lot of schools teach like this Unreal or Unity engine-based workflow or pipeline. I think with studios that use like proprietary game engines and proprietary tools, that's also an issue, because like the students or junior artists are used to, I hit one button and my stuff's in Unreal Engine, or it's very easy to get stuff into game engines. Whereas like when you're working with proprietary tools, you have to solve the problems of, all right, how do I get this stuff from Houdini into our actual game engine? And that's like a big problem that we're facing right now, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of speaks to what I was going to bring up as our next topic, which is really the idea of, and Andre, this is kind of a question for you, which is, how does your program take to pipeline focus, like production, like not just being able to make something look good in the viewport of Houdini, but the entire process of exporting the data and getting it into various game engines and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I want to first respond to the comments from Nick and Louise, because they're really good comments. Sure. And it's something for us, it's a struggle because we're not a trade school. So our students can't spend 4 years on just really learning in depth one particular aspect, right? So we're, as a research institution, they have to learn a whole bunch of different foundational, fundamental knowledge. And one of the biggest things that we also hear a lot from industry is like how to solve problems, how to think, how to learn, and so on, those kind of things, versus very tool-specific aspects. And it's a fine balance on where do you give the students enough time to actually hone skills to go in depth and trying to figure this out. Because when you only have a semester or two, that's not enough time, right? But to go to your question, John, in terms of the pipeline, pretty much most of our classes that have a practical focus aspects to them are really pipeline focused. So right now, I give you an example. I teach a class. It's called a vertical studio, where we have sophomores, juniors, and seniors all together in the studio. And the studio is set up like a game company, where we have different departments, an art department, programming, design. They're working together to create one project, one game, or a game demo at the end of the semester. And they only have 15 weeks to come from concept, from beginning to a really high polished final product. And that's, for anybody in the industry, that's really challenging for experienced folks. Never mind for students, right? To come up with something, because it's not just about creating, we made a game. Well, it needs to be high polished. It needs to have the quality standards that industry expects. It's a polish. The bugs need to be fixed, and so on. And so that's really important. I mean, Nick is right. Yes, we used to be Unity based. Now we're Unreal based. We don't have access to the game engines that the industry uses. Unfortunately, the proprietary. I mean, we used to do some projects with, I'm not going to talk about the specific engine, but with a game engine where we had in the lab access to it. But for the classroom, that would go a long way, right? Being able to do something like that. Actually having an industry engine that students have to, deal with and figure out versus just, okay, well, I press a button, whoa, it just works, right? Because
Right.
real life, it doesn't quite work that way.
Well, with that in mind, I would pose this back to Louise and Nick. If that's the case, that students don't really have access, obviously, to proprietary companies' game engines, then what are the pieces of the pipeline that you think schools should emphasize where it comes to like Houdini skills? If it's not specifically like the full pipe, because we know we can't have that last piece because that's difficult, then where do you think schools should be focusing more of their Houdini skills?
Yes, I'll take a little bit of that one. So first, I sympathize with the fact that there's not enough time, right? Because the school is where you figure out in the area of CG which bucket you want to kind of fall into, and there's a lot. Like you can be an animator, you can be a modeler, you can be a lighter. Like there's just across the board, and you kind of need to be exposed to all of it to make that decision. And even now with juniors, they come in and they're like, "I want to be a character artist," and it's like, "Well, do you really? Because do you know what that means? Like you're gonna be sculpting hairs or like."
Right.
Apps and it's not necessarily like you're going to come up with this new main player and you're going to do some high-res sculpting from scratch. So I think there's a little bit of like knowing exactly what each of the roles entail, and then being able to take enough time to deep dive and actually be like, okay, I want to be a fluid simulations person and really figure out, learn flow maps, learn how to export stuff. So I sympathize with the lack of time, and I don't really have an answer besides splitting up the course even more or scheduling more time. But I sympathize with that problem. But back to the question on the Unreal and custom engines and what part of the pipeline to focus on. Again, it depends, because I think there's an abundance of people now that know Houdini at that kind of superficial level, to where like we're saying there's like environment artists that now use it, and there's effects artists that use it at a kind of high level. And I think that's awesome. So I think now, before like just learning Houdini was like a huge plus, but now we're getting to the point that's like, okay, a lot of people are kind of showing up with Houdini on their resume, and we need to kind of dive a little bit deeper. And even Unreal, like even when I was at Side Effects, there's a lot of work that went to kind of getting stuff from outside of Houdini into Unreal, right? So just because it's a custom engine doesn't mean it's a solved problem. So you can kind of be like, okay, how did you optimize it? What were the problems that you ran into? And like, if we just focus strictly on the pipeline, there's still a lot of stuff. There's like volumetrics and 4D data and all sorts of kind of crazy stuff that we solved it a little bit, but it's still not a solved problem. So, but that's like if you want to be a pipeline TD, right? A pipeline tech artist, which not necessarily. Those are kind of hard to find. But I think there's a need for it, for those people.
Right.
I'd say from a VFX standpoint, some of the things that I wished were focused on is that like a lot of the stuff that we see coming in on portfolios, it'll be like an explosion simulation. But then when you like actually start to look at like if they break down the assets, it's using like 300 frames or something like that. And you're like, all right, that looks really great, but that's not feasible in the game. So like teaching ways to like optimize this stuff, how to make something look really good and use like a very low like texture memory budget on it. You know what I mean? Like for liquids, instead of using a simulation, for example, like can we make this into like a thresholding texture or an erosion texture? And how do we loop fire like simulation, but then loop it with like the least amount of frames and then maybe use motion vectors to smooth it out. Like that type of stuff is kind of what we're looking for. People having those type of skills versus just like, oh, I made this really cool explosion simulation. It looks awesome. But like when you break it down, it's just like, that'd be great for a movie sim, but in a game, like it's not going to work at all. You know what I mean? How do you take something that you see in a movie and break it down into the game side? Like, as we know, with a lot of this stuff, it has to be layered in. So like you'd have to render out your sparks separately. Those would be separate textures. The simulation of the explosion would be separate. The smoke would be separate. And then you build that up in the game. And I'm not sure, like, so like schools that teach the Houdini side, it is really like when you get into the industry and in the pipeline, like Houdini is one tool, right? But then you're creating basically, like a lot of times you're creating the assets that you're going to use in Houdini, but then those assets need to be assembled in some other type of particle editor outside of Houdini. So it's just having that type of knowledge from applicants is like kind of what we look for.
That's awesome. That's fantastic information. I was just thinking if there's a way that, I don't know, maybe some part of a curriculum could be an optimization, like a whole class, like based off of optimization, where you throw somebody, here's a fire sim, throw somebody, here's a fluid sim, throw somebody, here's a character animation. What would you do to make this the most efficient thing it could possibly be without degrading quality, right? That kind of injection. And of course, I'm sure from what I know of the A&M, it's there. It's just sprinkled throughout all the various courses as opposed to being one solid thing. But yeah, Andre, yes, please go ahead.
Well, actually, that brings me to a point, and I don't know if I'm foregoing one of your questions here, but that brings up another challenge for us. So, for example, I don't teach my students what industry needs today. Because that'll be outdated by the time they graduate. Right? The problems the industry is facing today, they need to solve today. But a student graduates in 3 or 4 years. Industry has moved on. So when the student comes out and graduate, well, that's no longer knowledge that's relevant. Right? So we're trying to figure out, okay, well, where's the industry going to be 3, 4, 5 years from now? What's the tool set that's required? And then looking, okay, what's the landscape? So LODs are probably going to go away. They're not going to be an issue. So I've stopped really talking about LODs because I don't think we're going to be really discussing LODs in 3, 4 years anymore or using them in the industry. So it's hard for us to also figure out what is that. I mean, it's hard for game companies, right, to know how they're going to be making games or movies 4 years from now, and the technologies that's underneath it. And so it's challenging to prepare the students for these very specific, like what you mentioned, optimization problems. But perhaps there's an opportunity, because the whole conversation here we have is about how do we work together. And one thing, I mean, Louis knows, he's been part of I always try to bring industry professionals into my courses, not just as guest lecturers, but also as mentors. And in the summer, we have one course where the students actually getting direct mentoring on a weekly basis from industry pros. But even that can only go so far. And here, what I'm hearing, there's a very specific needs that industry has. And that, for people, the skill set that we can't necessarily immediately address through our standard curriculum. But perhaps there's an opportunity to co-develop short courses or curriculum that we, an institution like us, can offer to our students or others that teaches them those kind of very specific skills that are needed now. And so then industry doesn't have to wait 4 years till students are graduating and come out, but it's a much shorter turnaround. And obviously we have the capacity and ability to create courses and training materials more so than a company would be able to set this up.
A couple of things. LODs are never going to go away, and they're making their way into film. So I just want to point that out. Because
here come the boxing gloves.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, we're looking at 3 years, 4 years in the future, but like having seen what most studios are kind of doing, there's like a thin layer of that bleeding edge of like maybe like 3, 4, 5 studios that are kind of doing really insane cutting edge stuff. And then there's a short bell curve that kind of goes to, that's probably like 10 to 20 years behind that curve. Like worst case, someone's 20 years behind, maybe 25 years behind that curve. And then like probably the average is 5 to 10 years behind that curve. And then people kind of do different areas. They're a little bit ahead in other areas. And even the bleeding edge studios are probably 10 years behind on different departments. So I think getting more information from the studios and kind of going like just looking at GDC and seeing like, okay, what feels breakthrough-ish here and what are the studios kind of doing that stuff, you should be able to just pin that and then use that as your kind of metric. And even that's probably going to be more future-proof that most studios won't be able to hit without kind of like custom tech. So even if we look like years ago, there was like Bungie was doing, or I think it was 343 was doing geometry caches for the Halo 5, I think. And even that's still not kind of commonplace. Unreal still doesn't have that tech. So I think there's definitely a gradient of what there's the cutting edge specialized engines can do, what Unreal is doing that's sometimes behind, sometimes ahead, like nanites ahead. And then there's a fall off of that. So don't try to get too ahead of the curve on like machine learning and Kubernetes and other bits that might not necessarily be too far into the future. And then you might pick something that doesn't necessarily align. And then I think I lost what the second bit was, but that I wanted to say it, that bit. Oh, the courses. Yeah, that's how I learned. So we had in my school UCF, we had night courses with EA teachers, and they basically got two people, Wes Grandmont and AJ German, that you probably knew from back then. One taught kind of like basic Mel scripting and just kind of like Mel Maya scripting, and that was kind of like a super specific. It wasn't just like tech cart. It was like this is this very narrow slice of it, and taught it to a really good level. And then the other one was a little bit more upended, but it taught us kind of like very specific problems like image-based lighting and how to capture a probe with like stacked things. And it was like very, very kind of practical directed things. So I don't know if that's something that the curriculum can kind of support, but kind of having these little 3-week workshops that kind of go a little bit deeper on a topic, that could be something that supplements the curriculum that's kind of like a static, like everybody needs to drink a little bit of the Kool-Aid in all the different departments.
Right. Well, it wouldn't be part of a curriculum. It would be something outside of the curriculum, because curriculums are pretty static, right? You have to have 120-hour credits. There's an approval process. It usually takes a year for curriculums to change and so on. But if you offer like workshops, that's what I was referring to, like that live outside the curriculum, that are available to students and or professionals, because there's, like you mentioned, there's a bunch of artists now out there that have Houdini skills, but they're lacking some in-depth knowledge. And so a workshop, and doesn't necessarily have to be taught by industry professionals, could be taught by us or a mix between industry and faculty. But it was kind of shorter workshops that are available that may be a solution addressing very specific needs that are current. Just quickly on I hear your point regarding looking out there in the industry, what's coming up and predicting the future. At least for us, we're not a pure game program. So we need to look at all of it. So for example, for us, there's a big push in using Houdini for non-entertainment purposes, because there's a lot of cutting edge stuff that's being done outside of games. And there's also lots of jobs available, right, where people are looking. So we also need to prepare our students for the job market, right? And there's only so many jobs at Pixar or at an EA, right, that are available. And there's all these schools that are creating talent, right?
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that kind of, we've sort of touched on this, and it's sort of a two-part, I guess, question. But in some respect, you need to make the most multifaceted and talented student that you can. Like that's almost the product that you're producing, is this talent inside of this person, right? But at the same time, like most of those students just after graduation are probably not going to step into a pipeline TD type role. They're going to be more junior roles that they're going to be taking. So it's the foundational material that becomes almost more important than some of their like diversity of skill. And I know that's a difficult thing to balance. I mean, I was a student at one point too. I think we all at some point were learning what to do in this industry and how it works. So that kind of leads into what the next question is, which is, and I'll pose this to Louise and Nick, which is, what are the best steps for somebody coming into the industry brand new to take? Like if it's coming right out of school, or even if they're self-taught, like what is the thing that would prepare them the most to be hired at a studio, for instance, like Rockstar?
I mean, I'm sure we both have comments on this, but I think the main thing that I see is gearing, like take the time to gear your portfolio towards the position that you're going after. Like don't apply for a VFX job with a bunch of animations and character art on it. And then like one little fire effect. Like I think taking the time to know what the position is that you're after and gearing your portfolio to that is very important.
Yeah, I think I would echo that too. It's like we're even interviewing people that it's like, do you want this position or another one? Because your portfolio is telling me you want this other position. Are you taking this one because that's the open one because you don't know what that is? Or like that's so definitely like taking the time to kind of polish your portfolio to it. I will say working on projects by yourself or with a team outside of work. Like I did modding way back in early 2000s, back when that was a thing. And that was like you had the source engine, that was it that you could do to kind of modify games. Now with Unreal and Unity, there's literally no excuse why you can't. Like it's just a matter of time and kind of dedication at this point to kind of just have a little prototype of something. And you can do an animation, you can do a model, you can do an environment, you can do a tool, Houdini running in Unreal. There's like so much openness to it that's what we're kind of looking at to. It's like there's the students are coming out with that level, and it's like the ones that get hired immediately are the ones that have that level of kind of polish and sophistication. And if you didn't get that from the task that you were assigned to in the base curriculum, like Andre said, that's not necessarily the place that's going to give you the highly specialized, I did a pyro effect warping through space with motion vectors. Maybe it just wasn't assigned to it, but doesn't mean that you shouldn't go out of your way and just kind of either take a little bit of time, work outside of your school hours to kind of get a reel that looks like that and just kind of build that up.
Yeah, you mentioned working on group projects like outside of the classroom, outside of curriculum, like getting together with friends and doing some kind of little project together. And that kind of leads into a question that's for everybody, which is when you're looking at reels or when you're looking at a prospective student, maybe this is about soft skills too, and not just Houdini skills, but like teamwork and taking criticism and those kinds of things. So the overall general question is basically, how do you value from the school's perspective and from the studio's perspective, how do you value group projects that students work on? What efficacy does that have for you? And how do you know who did what? And is that an issue and that kind of thing?
I'll jump in first, I guess. I mean, it's definitely, I like to see the group projects, but I don't like that everything on a portfolio is like a group project, because as you said, like you don't know how much the actual individual contributed to the stuff that's in there. Like they could say that they did X, Y, and Z, but you don't know for sure. So I think having a good balance of like group projects and individual work, because like I think you want people to be able to work on a team, but you want somebody to be self-sufficient as well and be able to kind of figure out issues on their own instead of staying stagnated, especially now with work from home. Like we're more detached. You're not sitting next to people in the office. You can't just turn to somebody and ask for help. So having the ability to like work on your own and kind of drive your own work outside of a group is definitely important. And I think it should be emphasized as well. I mean, just talking to some junior artists that we've hired recently, they said that a lot of the time it was all group projects, and they maybe had one or two small like individual things. And basically those were all curriculum geared tasks. So they had very little time to work on anything that kind of interests them. So I think maybe potentially having some time in the courses where people can actually make their own project or something. Otherwise it has to be done outside of the school hours or outside of the curriculum.
Yeah. And honestly, that's a problem that professional portfolios have too, where it's like, if you look at a marketing shot of a game and someone says like, I built the system that scatter the trees. And it's like, well, I don't know what that means. And if the system was good and if they spent a lot of time kind of manually placing things after the system. So if anything, students are in a better position to kind of deep dive and show this is the behind the scenes. This is what it looks like. And even on like the effects, like some of the best reels are just like, here's a sphere like fighting another sphere and doing all of the little things. And then here's a breakdown of what that looks like. And as opposed to like some beauty shot from a action movie that is just like layered comps that you're like, I don't know what you did here or how long it took you to do that, if you took feedback from artists or if you were trying to hit a reference. So I think showing that process, that's like, here's the reference that I even found or drew. Here's the thing that I was working towards. So from that side, I think it's important. But the soft skill side is important too, to where it's like, but that comes off usually in the interview after your portfolio is good enough. That will ask like, why did you build this? Did you build this for someone? Did you build it for yourself? What feedback did they give you? Were you trying to hit a look? That there was their feedback on the look? How much like, and you kind of deep dive a little bit on that. So I think it's important for the students to have that exposure of kind of working with the different disciplines. There's like I had to rig for an animator, and the animator gave me feedback on the rig, and we kind of had to iterate on it. Or I built the system for a tool for someone else to kind of scatter trees around, and this is the stuff that they wanted, and so I built it into the tool. And this is where we disagreed, and this is kind of how we resolved those disagreements.
Yeah, I think just to jump in again real quick, that the part about the breakdown, like any reel that has a breakdown on it that's showing like the steps that the artist took, it's like those are the ones that we gravitate towards, because it's like you're not just showing something that looks cool and it could be completely unoptimized and the node network looks like a spaghetti mess. Like if you're letting us see behind the scenes of what you did, there's a good chance that like you actually know what you're doing. Otherwise you wouldn't expose what your process was. So like I think a lot of times, like when we get really good breakdowns on a reel, those are the people. I know I've personally hired 2 people based off of the detailed breakdowns that they've done on their portfolio. So
that's
definitely
awesome.
goes a long way.
Yeah, and Andre, I'll give you the chance now too to talk about that and how you have developed those skills with your program and your students as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and something, I guess, because our program has always been very much, at least to some degree, in tune and in touch with industry. And coming myself from industry, we, for example, the studio class, we teach students work on a group project, but each person also has to do their own project at the same time. And it's something that they choose. It's not a curriculum project. It's something that I want to learn rigging, or I want to do environment art, or I want to try this effect. And so they get to spend on that project under the supervision and mentorship of the faculty, obviously, for a whole semester, and just focusing on that. Group projects are important for us because just the social skills, right? The soft skills, being able to take critique, being able to give critique, on work and working with others. Communication skills are so important, especially when you are, working remotely. It's more important to be able to really communicate with your peers. And so we try to focus really on both and emphasize that and make sure that the students really understand. Yes, because on a personal project for a student, it's a quality. Is it just really hard to get to the kind of quality than, if we're working with a group on a project? And the reality is, with thousands of students graduating every year, the first thing recruiters look at is the quality of the reel, right? And so our students are up against all of the other students, and right, the first look, it's graphic sells. It sells in the game store. It sells on the demo reel, right? If you have a good graphic, okay, that's okay, your entryway, and then having the rest behind it obviously is really important. But if you don't have something polished on your reel, nobody's gonna even start talking to you on how you did something, right? And so we have to find that balance, get them to somewhere where there's some really polished work on the reel. And I always say it's quality over quantity, and then be able to provide the depth behind it.
Yeah, for sure. That's super important, and I can't tell you how many, just from hiring interns that apply to be interns with us at Side Effects. That's one of the biggest critiques that I always have when I interview somebody. Is I'll say it's all about the breakdowns. All about the breakdowns. There's no other way. Like, I need to see how you thought about that. And if there's all the standards with, wipes and showing the Houdini interface and scrolling through lines of code, and some things are like important and other things you just kind of bypass. It's like showing me a network at 8 times speed. Like, I don't know what's going on there, but trying to find that way of showing how you're thinking and presenting that in a reel is actually, it's a difficult problem. It's easy for me to say, I know what I like when I see it, and that's a good breakdown.
Yeah.
But it's hard to tell somebody how to build a good breakdown out of their project, right?
That's a really good point, because while I'm trying to help our students get really good polished work that they can show off, the one thing I've got to be honest, I have not been focusing a lot on is telling them and include a breakdown. Obviously break down what it is you did on a group project, right? You want to really specifically call that out. And to your point, Louis, the students have an advantage. I couldn't pull out, or you couldn't pull out something out of Madden. And, oh, well, here's the things that I did, because it's just not possible, right? But the students can pull out the individual pieces. They did. But the breakdown, that's a really good point on creating something that now also explains the thought process behind it. Because it's not about, okay, here's a node network, right? I mean, you can have a node network with 4 nodes or with 20 nodes, and just because one is 4 nodes doesn't necessarily make it better, right? You want to understand, well, what were you thinking? Why do you have 20 nodes here, for example? Because that may be really clever. It's like, oh my God, that's so clever, and it's so much more future-proof than the 4 nodes, because they'll only address this one issue, and then I have to redo it all over again, right, for example. Because, 3 of the nodes are edit nodes. That's
right, or one wrangle. And it's
yes. Right, yes.
Yeah, no, the one thing that speaks to that is it's a weird soft skill, but it's presentation skills. And that's a thing. And even in production, I honestly didn't learn that until I was at SideFX, but how to show your work, how to kind of present, how to speak to an audience, how to document things, those are all valid skills that even as a junior, especially now with remote work where most things are asynchronous and you kind of just have to kind of leave a note for someone that's going to pick that up in the future. And you kind of need to be thorough and be like, this is why this is here. This is important. This I wasn't really sure. So if you want to take a look at that and fix it, go for it. And just kind of walking through your work and kind of documenting it it's a really important skill that it's basically like writing code at this point.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank all 3 of you for being here today. This has been a really great conversation. I think there was a lot of good knowledge passed back and forth. So thank you all very much for being a part of today's discussion in the Education Hive. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.